Good morning everybody, and welcome. Whether it is your first time stepping onto Vermont Law School's campus or whether this is a location that you visit every day, welcome. The Symposium, Criminal Culpability, Who Deserves Punishment, brings us all here together at a unique place and time. Currently, the United States has the highest incarceration rate in the world. While we're home to only 5% of the world's population, we house 25% of our returning citizens. And additionally, Vermont, which is a place that is very near and dear to my heart as my home state, despite our beautiful foliage and idyllic scenery, we're battling our own challenges against opiate addiction, trying to find the best way to invest in rehabilitation and transitional housing. So rehabilitating our nation's criminal justice system and restructuring sentencing reform, those are topics I'm going to leave to our panelists for the day. And the panelists that you have today, who you're going to hear from, represent the textured face of criminal justice reform. Former prosecutors, defense counsel, professors at the forefront of their field, and policymakers. Thank you all to all of our panelists for being here today and for joining us. It's going to be a great conversation. But before I turn you over to today's discussion, I want to thank somebody very special who isn't here today. And that person is Christine Billis. Ms. Billis is a hairstylist, and she's an outstanding debater, and she's an artist. And it is her artwork that you see featured on all of our promotional materials. But Ms. Billis, in addition to all of those things, is also incarcerated at the Chittenden Regional Correctional Facility, which is Vermont's sole all-female correctional facility in the state. Ms. Billis, along with other folks from Community High Schools Vermont at the Chittenden Regional Correctional Facility, and folks from Northeast Correctional Facility and Mill River Union High School, all contributed to Criminal Culpability's art competition for this year. And so all of the artwork that you see out in the hallway has been donated from them. And it was a fierce competition to choose the winner. I hope you'll take the time to check it out later. Each of those folks wrote a statement as well, and they feel as though, in their way, they have been affected by the opioid crisis in this state, and additionally by the criminal justice system. And while they couldn't be here to participate on a panel, they wanted to make sure that their voices were heard as well. So please take the time. There's also places for you to write notes back to the artists, so I encourage you to do so, because they took the time to put those pieces together, and they're very excited to hear your feedback on them. Additionally, I would invite Mr. Howe to stand. Mr. Howe is from Community High School of Vermont, and he was part of the push to help get the art competition to folks, helped us to get art back and forth, and please ask him later on about some of his students. Thank you so much for being here this morning. Thank you to Vermont Law School for hosting this event and giving Vermont Law Review a venue to bring together so many powerful voices. Thank you to all of the folks who contributed to making this event happen, particularly Candy and Kelsey, who have coordinated since February to bring us all here together. And thank you to you all for being here to join in this dialogue. Welcome. Welcome to Vermont Law School. Thank you. Professor Dean McCormack.
Good morning. In addition to today being Symposium Day, it's also Constitution Day. So I wanted to take this moment to wish you and yours a happy Constitution Day. It's a day that honors the adoption of the U.S. Constitution and those who have become U.S. citizens. So 2 reasons to celebrate today. Welcome to Vermont Law School. On behalf of VLS, I want to extend a warm welcome to all of our visiting scholars and guests of VLS. We're so grateful to have you here today and to be a part of this symposium. I had a chance to meet some of the speakers last night at a dinner, and I learned so much just in a short meal that I know that today will be an exciting day for everyone in the audience. I want to acknowledge the members of Vermont Law Review who have put this day together, and especially Jessica Bullock, Kelsey, Bain, and Katherine Spindler. I've been so impressed with the professionalism that these students have shown in organizing this event. There was a point last night when I was watching them network around the room, making sure every one of the speakers was comfortable, making sure that we were all having a good time, and I thought back to what was I doing the second week of my third year of law school? And then I looked at them for a while and I thought, not that. Those students, those three students and many members of the Law Review really bring honor to this school every single day. And I suspect that one day we're all going to be saying we knew Jessica, Candy, and Kelsey once. Now, many of you know Vermont Law School as the environmental law school, and if you didn't know, the composting toilets and solar panels and electric car stations would have told you that. But what you may not know is that we also have a formidable and growing criminal law program. It's led by professors like Professor Sand and Professor Taub, who you'll hear from later today, and it deserves some serious attention. We were recently ranked by the National Jurist as one of the top schools for prosecutors and public defenders. This recognition was based on our curricular offerings, our employment placement, our debt and starting salary for new graduates. The program and our many successful alumni practicing in the criminal law field fit perfectly and proudly into Vermont Law School's motto of law for the community and the world. And as does today's discussion. As Jessica told us, the United States has a larger prison population than any place in the world. And at the same time, many of those who cause the most harm are left unpunished or hardly punished. Another one of our mottos here at Vermont Law School is that the status quo is no longer acceptable. So it's no surprise that our students have put together today's event and brought so many great minds together to discuss this problem and to discuss the question of who is punished and why. We may not find the answers today, but it promises to be an exciting discussion and an informative day. I really want to thank you for being here, and I now want to introduce Kelsey Bain, class of 2017, Symposium editor, and all-around outstanding member of the Vermont Law School community. Thank you.
Hi guys, Katherine, do you want to come up as well? I think we can do this together. So in the mess of organizing all of this, I haven't prepared anything super long, but also I think keeping it mercifully short will probably be welcomed. I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank all of our panelists who have been putting up with my emails and Candy's emails and organizing this whole thing. I really want to thank the Vermont Law School, or the Vermont Law Review staff for also putting up with me. Today would not have been possible without you guys, so thank you. We have a fantastic schedule lined up. It's up there. We're probably going to run a little bit late today, but I think it's worth it, so please stick around. We'll have lunch a little bit later, and then if anyone needs help with anything, please come find me. Candy?
Brilliant. Good morning, and thank you all for coming. As you have probably gathered by the comments that have come before me, Vermont Law School is a special place. We come here either like Jess, residents of Vermont, or individuals who, for a few years, are going to take up the state as our home, while we allow it to nurture our thirst for legal knowledge. And being Vermont's only law school puts us in a unique situation. We not only have the ability to effectively look around us and see the issues we see in our state, but we also have the capacity and perhaps obligation to address that. And one of the most powerful ways that we can do that is by bringing together powerful minds. As you will see today, a good amount of those powerful minds are gathered here today in the form of our speakers, who through their expertise and experience will be able to talk about things such as drug reform and white-collar crime in a way that offers a diversity of opinions. But there are other powerful minds at play as well. We also very much encourage you to look at the powerful minds on display in our hallway that represent the voice of our state's children and also incarcerated individuals and address their thoughts and feelings on the subject as well. And among the other powerful minds here today are you yourself as audience members. You in your capacity as students, teachers, attorneys, brothers, sisters, daughters, wives, and most importantly, voters, have the incredible power to not only harbor your own thoughts, but vocalize and share them. Today, we encourage you to do exactly that by listening to our speakers, participating in the discussions, and taking these thoughts and the ideas that you form back to your home. Right now, as Jess did address, we do face an opioid crisis in Vermont, and we encourage you to think creatively and thoughtfully about ways that we can address the crisis and bring about effective change to our state. Today, I hope you enjoy. Nothing that is occurring here today would have been possible without the efforts of some very important people, chiefly Professor Taub. We would not have been able to do any of this without your experience and guidance throughout the entire process, and we are very grateful. And furthermore, Professor Sand has been incredibly helpful and instrumental through his own experience and guidance. And here at Vermont Law Review, we also believe that powerful ideas and powerful discussion require equally powerful coffee and delicious food. And for that, we would also like to thank Jed and his team at the Fox Stand Inn. We are very much appreciative of your delicious, delicious beverages and pastries, and we look forward to lunch. Thank you so much, and with that, I'll turn to Professor Taub. Thank you.
So thank you, Candy, so much for that really kind introduction. And I promise all of you I will be brief, notwithstanding my past speaking history. As we begin the day, I'd like to invoke the memory of someone who is not here with us, but I believe greatly influenced this event. And that is Edwin Sutherland. About 77 years ago, in December 1939, Sutherland coined the term white-collar crime in a paper he delivered. This was for a joint meeting of the American Sociological Society and the American Economic Society. He defined the term white-collar crime to refer to a crime committed by a person of respectability and high social status in the course of his occupation. He stated that the thesis of his paper was that the conventional conception and explanations of crime are misleading and incorrect. His goal, then, was to make a, quote, comparison of crime in the upper or white-collar class composed of respectable, or at least respected, business and professional men, and crime in the lower class comprised of persons of low socioeconomic status. Of course, the term has evolved over time and grown to have broader and multiple meanings in the legal arena and public sphere. Like Sutherland, the students at Vermont Law Review have organized this event to make comparisons and to challenge the conventional wisdom. Accordingly, our panels will explore 3 provocative questions concerning criminal culpability. First, does criminal law disproportionately punish drug offenders? Second, does criminal law go easy on white-collar crime? And lastly, a policy question at the end of the day, where should criminal law focus its attention? Also at lunch, our keynote speaker will talk about his forthcoming book on white-collar crime called The Chicken Shit Club. I'll leave it to him to explain the title. I will now invite up our first panel, led by Professor Bobby Sand, to come up. And in the words of my favorite character from the musical Hamilton, Angelica Schuyler, I leave you to it.
Good morning. As a graduate of this incredible institution and a former managing editor of the Vermont Law Review, it is a great honor to be the moderator at this first panel. I still have the quill and parchment that I used to write my Law Review note some years ago. So this first panel looks at the question of whether drug offenses and drug offenders are punished disproportionately harshly as compared to others within the criminal justice system in general, and then more specifically as compared to so-called white or bright-collar offenders. Before introducing this incredible panel, let me give some context to that discussion and perhaps set up an anticipatory point of contrast to what you may hear. Students of criminal law know that we have two principal theories of punishment in this country. The retributivists say that we should punish people who commit crimes because they deserve consequences. Blameworthy behavior is deserving of a response. The utilitarians, in contrast, look to the future and say that the only reason to impose punishment is to serve a social value, to create a net improvement in public safety, a net reduction in harm. We know as well that there's no obligation to follow either one of those two theories consistently, and importantly, subject only to some limitations created principally by the Due Process Clause and the prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. State legislatures and Congress at the federal level have extraordinarily broad discretion to decide what conduct should be deemed criminal and to set the maximum penalty or the penalty range for violations of that criminal conduct. So against that background of extraordinarily broad legislative authority to define crimes, let's look at the issue of whether drug offenders are punished disproportionately harshly. So, I will briefly introduce our three panelists. You can find out more about their background in the conference material. When I'm done, each of them will have 10 minutes to tell you some more about themselves, what they're doing now, and their views about the disproportionality of drug punishment. After that, we will have an opportunity for some dialogue, and if there is still time remaining, we'll take a few carefully worded and concise questions from the audience. So, to my immediate left, Professor Ekow Yankah. Professor Yankah is a professor at Cardozo School of Law. His scholarship has appeared in a variety of books, law reviews, and peer-reviewed legal theory journals. He has also been a distinguished visitor at the MacArthur Foundation. His current work and forthcoming book explores Republican theories of political obligation grounded in civic duty and its relationship to law generally and criminal law in particular. Professor Yankah has been recognized as one of the top 50 influential law professors under 50. He serves on the executive board of the Innocence Project and American Constitution Society's New York chapter. His opinion pieces have appeared in, among other places, the New York Times, the New Yorker, and the Huffington Post. Please welcome Professor Yankah. In the middle of our panelists, Jeremy Haile. Jeremy's portfolio covers a range of issues including sentencing policy, racial disparities, and mass incarceration. Mr. Haile was instrumental in passing bipartisan legislation signed into law by President Obama to protect lawyer trust accounts that fund legal aid. He has maintained a deep interest in criminal justice policy since making regular visits as a college student to prisoners outside of Abilene, Texas. Since joining the Sentencing Project, where he serves as federal advocacy counsel, his work has appeared regularly in the media, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and NPR's All Things Considered. Please welcome Jeremy Haile. lastly, to the far left, at least geographically, Professor Mark Osler. Professor Osler's work advocates for sentencing and clemency policies rooted in principles of human dignity. He writes on clemency, sentencing, and narcotics. His writing on clemency, sentencing, and narcotics policy has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and numerous law journals. A former federal prosecutor, he played a role in striking down the mandatory 100-to-1 ratio between crack and powder cocaine in the federal sentencing guidelines by winning the case of Spears versus United States in the United States Supreme Court, with the court there ruling that trial judges could categorically reject that 100-to-1 ratio. He has testified as an expert before the United States Sentencing Commission and the United States House Subcommittee on Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security. Please welcome Professor Osler. Gentlemen, let me suggest that you speak in the order of your introduction. So Professor Yankah first, and feel free to grab the podium or stay seated as you prefer.
If everybody's okay with it, I'm happy to stay seated. So first I want to, well, sort of thank the two young ladies, excuse me, the two young ladies in particular, Kelsey Bain and Candy Spindler, I believe, and all your staff. I know how hard it is to make things look easy, and you've done a remarkable job shepherding academics, which is its own. In particular, Ms. Bain showed remarkable patience with my schedule, which is weaponized. I do want to add a small note to this. Lots of people will tell you how great these young ladies are. You should be a little suspicious. I understand that talented young students are actually coming for our jobs, so I don't congratulate them with perfect ease, but we will be honored when they take them, and the world will probably be in better hands in any case. We've been asked to spend a few minutes, sorry, I want to make sure to keep the time. So we've been asked to spend a few minutes speaking about how we got here, how we got, I'm not going to tell you how I got to Vermont Law School, which is very beautiful and somewhat remote, but I think you meant more, it is very beautiful. I think you meant more generally how we got to our place in life or so. It's a bit, for me, it feels a bit odd, but I actually remember being in your seat, so maybe it is helpful to remind students that there's life and jobs after law school in a challenging time. So let me first say that unlike the talented students in front of you, I didn't have it figured out when I was, I mean, never mind my second year of law school. When I graduated, this may provide some small comfort to some of you. When I graduated, all my friends had very fancy jobs lined up at very fancy institutions, and I felt like I had worked hard. I had some successes, some failures, and I didn't have one of these jobs. And I, to be really honest with you, had real bouts of self-doubt, had real, I didn't know what was wrong with me, why was I a bit lost? I knew I was a bit lost because the things that were on offer weren't the things that I loved. And it turns out that's okay. I mean, you don't want to be lost forever, but it turns out that, I'm going to tell you just one small trick. People tell success stories backwards. You have to remember this. They're lying to you, right? They don't mean to, but they're lying to you. So Nelson Mandela, I mean, you can pick somebody, but they're not people I admire much more than Nelson Mandela, right? When you tell the story of Nelson Mandela's life, it looks like he was inevitably heading to be Nelson Mandela, right? When Nelson Mandela was being put into Robin prison, he was just some guy. I mean, that's not quite true. He'd already been a remarkable leader. But it's not like Nelson Mandela knew what the future held for him. He didn't know he was going to become Nelson Mandela. He was presumably terrified like the rest of us and thought, I might not make it, right? When you see your law professors, it's easy to think, oh, yeah, they were born law professors. No. No, right? It's not, the idea that everybody else is inevitably headed for success and you're the only one who doesn't know what's going on is a myth. It's only because after they're successful we tell the story backwards. It's also true about failures, by the way, and it's something we should remember as we talk about prisoners. It's not that their lives were fated to be not successful. There are choices that they've made, some of which deserve real condemnation and punishment, but there are also choices that we've made about how their lives turn out. But I don't mean to digress. Anyway, to be much more quick, Graduated from law school, didn't know what I was going to do. Some professors pulled me aside and they said, what are you going to do? I said, Professor, I'm going to get a job, because that's what people do. My professor said, you shouldn't get a job. So I was very, very blessed. Some professors of mine approached my dean of my law school and said, we think he should be something, do something. And my dean said, that's fine, too bad, right? Because what deans know is that if they take care of these professors' pet student, they'll have to take care of every professor's pet student. So the dean rightfully said no, and my professors insisted, and eventually they gave me a fake title with very little everything, but it allowed me to be a fellow at my law school, which was remarkable. So I spent a year writing, and while I was writing, another professor who visited from my graduate institution was visiting, and towards the end of the year, he said, what are you going to do next year? I said, no. I've been through this before. I'm going to get a job. And he said, that's a shame. You'd really, really enjoy graduate work. Anyway, fast forward, I ended up doing graduate work. And when the third time they asked me what I was going to do, I said, look, people, I'm missing out on luxuries like food and heat. So I ended up practicing for 3 years at a law firm named Boyce, Schiller & Flexner, which is a terrific little law firm. And the joy of it is that it's a little law firm. By the way, all this, I want you to keep in mind that 2 years before, I had been totally lost and didn't know what was going to happen to me. And Boyce Schiller is famous for lots of things. I ended up working on what is still to this day the largest lawsuit in U.S. history. It's U.S. v. Philip Morris. It's just you and your friends fighting over $800 billion, right? Now, keep in mind, when you're fighting over $800 billion, lots of lawyers end up working on this case. It's not like I was leading the case. But it was a remarkable law experience, and it was remarkable because it's a very small law firm, so I got to be a lawyer fast, which was great. In the middle of all this, once again, somebody approached me about teaching. I'll skip the story, but the point is just, once I was finally offered a teaching position, I always tell people it's like dating somebody you like and then meeting the girl you love. I really liked practice. I really, really enjoyed it. But once I knew I could be a teacher, that was it for me. And so I started teaching and made the transition to being a philosopher. And among the joys of my job has been the way in which I slowly have learned to mix in writing both to my colleagues in dusty legal theory journals, which I love, and writing more publicly and speaking more publicly and doing what I think we all have as an obligation to share this luxurious position to do something with it. And so that's how I've come to be in this position. That was a very long-winded way of saying I'm an academic, but those two things go together. Okay. With all that being said, let me just say a few words, and then I'll try to end early because we have a lot of discussion to get to. The question is whether or not drug offenders are punished disproportionately. And as Professor Sands pointed out, I'm actually one of the people who's writing not in retributivist or utilitarian theory, though I spend a lot of my time arguing with folks in both camps. My theory that I'm trying to work out in a book length is a theory about what I call franchise, about the way in which we're fellow citizens, and how that's different than theories that think the point of punishment is either retributivism or utilitarianism. The bonds of our social obligations to each other, right? Our personal obligations are personal, but the bonds of our political obligations is that we're fellow citizens. And that means to me that the same powers that give us the right to punish you when you do something wrong to violate the bonds of our citizenship obligate us to reincorporate you. It's not just that you violated my rights and I punish you and now we're even, right? The very same thing that lets me interfere with your life and throw you in prison because you violated certain bonds are the very same things that mean I have to reincorporate you when you get out. And I think one of the problems we have is that our theories of punishment lack any view that we have to reincorporate returning citizens. So that's what I'm working on more generally. And lastly, on the question of whether or not, on the direct question asked, I'm in some ways a very simple-minded person, so I like to try as best as possible in my field to keep things simple. So here's what's happened. A young person gets addicted to a drug. They now want this drug in ways that are very, very bad for them. They occasionally steal from their mother, let's say, and get into a fight with their mom over money that they stole in their purse. They take the laptop from their friend, and maybe even in some ways they do other things that are problematic, right? What we have is a social problem, right? So I'm trying to reject the premise of the question, right? When we say are people punished disproportionately, we might think disproportionately to what? Keep in mind, when this thing has happened, there is no yet answer as to whether or not the question on the table is a question of criminal law, right? Criminal law is an obvious, powerful, and immediately available tool, but it's not at all obvious yet that what we ought to do is punished, much less disproportionate to what. One way we can talk about this is to see the dramatically different ways in which we've treated the opiate addiction epidemic, which is still not being treated well, but is being treated as a social problem in ways that are vastly different than the way in which we attacked, for example, the crack epidemic in the 80s and 90s, late 80s and mid 90s. Early 80s and mid 80s. It's just to say that when we view lots and lots of problems, there's a real question what we're collectively going to do. And that question, and again, let me just say it simply, it's no different than the question of what are we going to do with a school that's falling apart, or children that have insufficient food, and on and on and on. There are many, many social responses we can have to these kinds of questions. And it turns out, in ways that are heartbreaking, that our reply to those who are the most vulnerable, those who don't look like us, those who grow up in cities that we don't relate to sometimes, and yes, those who have different, darker skin, is often the knee-jerk reaction, oh, there's fighting in school, let's send in the police. But if it's our school, where our children go, right? If it's a lovely, I know this area is dotted with gorgeous boarding schools, the response is not, let's send in the police, right? So disproportionately to what already assumes that the only possible reply is that of criminal law, and that's deeply problematic. And I hope we'll get a chance to speak more about that.
Hi, so for the past 4 years, I've been handling federal advocacy at the Sentencing Project in Washington, D.C. But I grew up in Texas and went to college in a town called Abilene. And if you've ever seen the show Friday Night Lights, then you have a pretty good idea of what it's like there. Incidentally, that's also where I met Jen, my wife of 18 years. That's right, we got married when we were 9 years old. But it was in Abilene that I first spent time in prison, not as a prisoner myself, but as part of a prison education program. And I'd like to say it was because of my deep interest in social justice, but really it was out of curiosity. So I'm not sure what I expected, but this prison wasn't like I had seen in the movies. There were no dungeons or cells or anything like that. It was actually very bright and clean. There were these very large rooms with bunk beds, dozens of men. And so I'd spend my days sitting at a table bolted to the floor in the middle of this room, and the men would come over and visit with me. Most of them were black or Latino. And I got to know them, and most of them seemed like pretty regular guys, albeit guys who had made some pretty bad mistakes. And one individual in particular who I got to know was named Jason. He was Latino, a young man, and he was serving a long sentence for armed robbery after a drug deal that had gone bad. And that sounds scary, but as I got to know Jason, I realized that he was really sort of a gentle soul who had gotten caught up in a bad crowd. And, he came from a broken family. He had a daughter at home. And he admitted to me that he had messed up. But I couldn't help thinking that if he had had the same advantages and opportunities in life that I had had, that he would probably have been in a different place. And unfortunately, Jason's story is not that unusual. In the United States, there are 2.2 million people in prisons or jails. About 500,000 of those individuals are locked up for a drug offense. In addition, drug abuse accounts for a significant number of people incarcerated for property or violent offenses because of untreated addictions. So compared to 1980, the number of people incarcerated for a drug offense is up 1,200%. So this growth was not caused by changes in crime rates. It was changed by choices we made, namely the war on drugs. Talking about the policy, not the band. But that policy sent more people to prison and kept them there for longer periods of time. So in 1982, President Reagan gave a speech. He had a new initiative to curtail drug abuse, and he compared drug law enforcement to the Battle of Verdun in World War I, which was probably the costliest and deadliest battle in that war. And within a few years, Congress had passed several laws establishing across-the-board mandatory sentencing for drug offenses, providing billions of dollars for drug law enforcement, and establishing a policy to create a drug-free America. Well, needless to say, within a decade, there were few celebrations that we had achieved a drug-free America. Instead, what happened was these mandatory sentencing laws, which were aimed at breaking up drug cartels, largely missed their targets. And instead of kingpins, we ended up locking up in federal prison lower-level actors, so-called mules and couriers, street-level dealers, people like that, many of them struggling with drug abuse problems of their own. These are individuals like Alton Mills, who received a federal life sentence for his role as a low-level courier in a drug trade because he had two previous prior possession offenses. And a woman named Kimba Smith, who received a 25-year federal prison sentence for her participation in her boyfriend's illegal drug activity. Kimba had no prior criminal record, and at the time was 7 months pregnant. Thankfully, both of those individuals have recently received commutations from President Obama, but after spending many, many years in federal prison. And nor has this enforcement of drug law been equitable. As Ekow mentioned, at the federal level, or as he alluded to, 3/4 of people incarcerated for drug offenses are Black or Latino. That's even though whites use and sell drugs at roughly the same rates. Perhaps the most dramatic example of this is with crack cocaine policy. In the 1980s, the crack had emerged in some low-income areas, and Congress responded by establishing mandatory minimum penalties for crack that were much harsher than for powder cocaine. Well, it turns out that 80% of the people locked up for crack since that time have been African American. And if these mandatory penalties worked, if they reduced drug use, if they reduced the harm caused by drugs, you might be able to make an argument that they were justifiable on some level. But the fact is they don't work. According to the National Research Council that studied this, the long prison sentences do not account for a significant portion of the crime reduction. And this is for a couple of main reasons. One, because particularly for drug offenses, lower-level dealers are easily replaced. As long as there is a demand for illegal drugs, there will be a ready supply of sellers. And the other main reason is that people age out of crime. So the 18-year-old who is imprisoned for boosting some drugs from a pharmacy or something like that is much less likely to do that when he's 40. I have some other things to say about what's happening in Congress to try to address these issues, but I'll stop there for now. I did want to say a word about law school. There's a debate about, I'm sure you've been involved with it, maybe with your parents, whether law school is worth the time and especially the money. I think that's debatable, but I think it's the wrong question. I think the question to ask is, what do you want to accomplish with your life? And so my first position, it wasn't even a paid job after law school and having passed the bar exam, was sitting in a congressional office on a sofa answering constituent calls, to my parents' chagrin. Eventually I found, a career and a calling in criminal justice reform advocacy. I think I'll probably still be paying off my law school loans into middle age, basically there now. But I do, I wouldn't trade my legal education, and I love what it allows me to do. So.
All right. I'm going to stand up. So, first of all, Mr. Howe, amazing work. Are any of your students here?
No.
Not yet?
They're all...
Oh, okay, that makes sense. But I really admire what you've done. And I'm so glad to be here. I was getting ready, and I went back through my email and pulled up, just searched for Vermont Law School. And I found not only what I was looking for, which was, be sure to be on time and things like that, but I also found the emails I'd written to Vermont Law School over the years. I drove through here a while ago when I was teaching in Texas. And I was just driving through Vermont, and I walked in and I talked to some students. And I apparently wrote several emails after that saying, could I come speak? Could I come visit? And here I am. I'm living the dream. And it is a great thing. Professor, I am going to start at the start with a little bit of biography. In 1967, I was 4 years old. And I lived in the city of Detroit on the east side. There was a time when our parents told us we couldn't go outside because the riots were going on. Now, we lived on the east side of the city. The riots were centered on the west side. But the city was occupied not by the National Guard, but the riots were so severe, it was being occupied by the United States Army, by the regular army, people who had gone to Vietnam or come back. And so, kids couldn't go outside. So, of course, I went outside. And I snuck out, and I ran down the block, and there was a Jeep or an armored personnel carrier or something, and soldiers with rifles. And I was terrified. And I ran the other way. And what I remember is my mom running behind me and sweeping me up in her arms and bringing me home. Now, that riot, some people would call it a rebellion, was rooted in racism, and it had a lot to do with criminal justice. It started because a party for 2 black Vietnam veterans was broken up in a way that was too violent, where they arrested everybody indiscriminately, and the riot began as a reaction to that. When I was in law school, I realized the importance of criminal justice, and I thought the best way for me to be a part of it was to be a prosecutor. And I went back to Detroit, and I was a prosecutor there from 1995 to 2000. When you're a prosecutor in Detroit at that time, you do a lot of crack cases, and that's what I did, among other things. And so the problem that we're discussing, I played a role in causing it. Now, at the time, like a lot of people, I believed that what we were doing was going to solve a problem, that by incapacitating crack dealers, we would solve the very real problem that crack presented in communities both black and white. We were wrong, of course. And I want to talk briefly about things that I hadn't thought through at that time that fits in with what Jeremy just said as well. There's 4 hard facts about narcotics that need to frame any discussion that we have. And the first is that Americans like drugs. That we as a nation are the world's leading consumer of recreational drugs. And even over-the-counter and prescription drugs, we use at a far greater rate than most societies. Things like prescription opiates, I think it's 85% of prescription opiates in the world are sold in the United States. It kind of fits with some other aspects of the American culture. The individualism, We have an attraction to escapism through movies and things like that, and a tolerance for risky behavior. And so we have to accept that, at least as our culture exists now, there is an appetite for narcotics. And that leads to the second truth, which is that narcotics are a market that's driven by that demand. That unlike other types of crimes that we prosecute, narcotics are rooted in a market system. They're controlled by the laws of supply and demand. And one of the things that means is that through interdiction and other things on the law enforcement side, the most we can hope for is to raise the price of drugs. That's the most we can hope for, because it's a market. And if we restrict the supply and demand remains constant, then the price will go up. That is our highest ambition in trying to control narcotics. And that leads to the third truth that I want to talk about, and that is that a terrible way to do that is by sweeping up low-wage labor, because it does nothing to affect the market. That when I was a prosecutor, a typical case, and one that specifically I remember, was an 18-year-old. He had 5.3 grams of crack, and he had a gun under a seat cushion in the house where he was selling crack. First offense. He got a 10-year sentence, 5 years for the crack and 5 years stacked for the gun. And there's no parole in the federal system, so he was going to do at least 8.5 years of those 10 years. That didn't affect the market, not a bit. I actually, because it was my case and it went to trial, I drove by the house before the trial just to get an eye on it, and there was someone else selling crack there. It made no difference whatsoever. And so we have to remember that too, that if what we're trying to do is the one thing that we can do, which is raise the price somewhat, at least temporarily, the last way we want to do it is by sweeping up low-wage labor. And then the fourth fact is this, that we have chosen moralism over problem solving. And perhaps I'm characterizing retributivism as moralism, but that's the way it comes across. And I say this as one of the people making those moral statements in court, one of those people that in closing would say, the reason this is wrong is because this person is poisoning his community. That's a very popular prosecutor line. You know, of course, we could apply that to people who own fast food joints, casinos, probably the Philadelphia Flyers. But we went awry at a very specific time, and that is, and it relates to crack. You know, crack really drove the higher sentences. And in the 1980s, and there's a few of us here who remember the 1980s, there were two public health crises that happened at the same time, and they were AIDS and crack. And at the start, both were viewed as scourges of communities that were looked down upon. Of course, crack was seen as an African-American problem, and AIDS was primarily seen as afflicting gay men, heroin addicts, and people from Haiti. And that also, all three groups, not favored in society. Now, what happened from there, though, is very telling, because there's a point of differentiation. And it's at a precise time, 1986. In 1986, two things happened. One is that Len Bias died, a basketball player from the University of Maryland. And it was thought to be, it was 2 days after he was drafted by the Celtics. For those of you from the Boston area, you know it could be a big deal. In 1986, I think they were defending champions of the NBA. They had the second overall pick, and they picked this guy, Len Bias from the University of Maryland, who then dies 2 days after the draft. Now, people in Boston were enraged, and that meant that Tip O'Neill and Ted Kennedy were incentivized to do something about crack. Now, they just picked a number at random, and they came up with the 100-to-1 ratio that's been so pernicious, and which I used to support in court. Now, and AIDS went a different direction. And instead of the face being the 6'9" black Len Bias, the face of AIDS became Ryan White, a middle school student in Kokomo, Indiana. And also, the champion became C. Everett Koop, the Surgeon General of the United States. AIDS went the direction of problem solving. They identified the disease that underlaid it, the structures that created it, and they did something about that. However, and they stepped away from the moralism that had been asking for things like mandatory testing and things like that for people who might suffer from AIDS. And with crack, we haven't yet gotten away from the moralism. And the same is true with other drugs. We'll have to wait and see what happens to the reaction with opiates, something that primarily affects whites, or is perceived as affecting whites as opposed to African Americans. There's a lot more to discuss, and like everybody else, I look forward to the questions.
There is so much to talk about. We're going to cancel all the other panels and just continue. No, just kidding. All of you have touched on this a little bit, but Ekow, let me ask you first, and then others please weigh in. The publicly reported face of addiction is of a lighter hue now than it was during the crack epidemic. And it seems that our response is now somehow different. And I know you've commented on PBS NewsHour and other places about that. I wonder if you'd like to elaborate or share your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, so look, it's not fun to sometimes play, again, the simplistic person. And frankly, it's not always fun to be the black person saying, well, look, this could be all about race. Though if others were willing to do it, you wouldn't have to be the only person to do it. Happily on this panel, I'm not. I'll just start where Mark left off, if I may. Look, we shouldn't be confused as to what's happening, right? So we now have this opiate addiction epidemic, and it's a stunning one. It is one of the things that has contributed to America having, for the first time, a rollback in life expectancy, right? The opiate, I mean, this for the wealthiest country in the world is stunning. By the way, there's a cruel irony that the CDC believes that actually part of the reason we now have this opiate addiction is because doctors overprescribed painkillers, and it turns out that doctors overprescribe painkillers to white people. That is to say, there's this cruel irony that part of what happened is that when doctors see people in pain, they respond differently depending on the race of the person, right? So they do lots of audit studies on this. They give a doctor the exact same readout. Just so you're clear about this. I mean, I think sometimes we find these things so upsetting, we try to find a way to think it can't be so. So they just give doctors the same charts, and they say, how are you gonna treat this person? And if the name on top of it signaled white, a doctor was much more willing to prescribe painkillers, whereas if the name signaled black, they were much less willing. And they tried to describe why this might be the case. Anyway, if you generalize this across a country, then it turns out that you're introducing a huge number of people to painkillers, which then years later turns out to, I mean, this is not the only story, but this is part of the story. So there's just cruelty on cruelty built into this pain. Then what happens? So, as we said, part of what happens then is how we decide to deal with this socially. Now, I don't want to deny that part of the story is that America has gone through a generation and a half of a failed drug war. And so I don't think it's just that Americans said, well, we don't care about black people, we only care about white people. I think part of it is you see person after person say, we've tried the other model and it failed. But of course, you have to ask why a generation and a half of black souls have to be fed to prisons and halfway houses, and then again arrested because, and on and on and on. And the answer to that just is, I think Mark's story captures it exactly right. When we see the young AIDS victim was somebody we could think that could be us, then the entire nation mobilized to decide what to do about this problem. Once it wasn't just a gay problem. when you hear story after story, again, I don't want to pretend it's all great out there. I mean, there are lots of heroin addicts being locked up with very little treatment. But here's what's true. The presidential candidates, including the Republican presidential candidates, spent time on national television telling us that drug addiction was a public health scourge and sharing stories of sisters and brothers and sons and daughters who had become addicted to heroin. That was not the response in the 90s, right? And it's not the case that in the 90s, people's brothers and sisters were not being addicted to crack. It was that you were ashamed, you hid it, and for those who were there, you remember reading obituaries where people did everything they could to avoid saying what had happened or how they died, right? Because you couldn't admit that your brother or sister had been addicted to the black drug. So there's a deep difference in every level of of what we see about our humanity in those who we decide to call criminal. And I'll just wrap up by saying this. Look, I mean, and I'm happy to take questions. There are lots of people who push back on this story. They say, well, look, the violence is different, the addiction is different. All of this I find totally unpersuasive. I shouldn't say mostly unpersuasive. I mean, what happened is during one drug epidemic, we did nothing about it for years and years and years, allowed an underground market that became massive to flourish, cordoned off cities with militarized policing, and then we said, man, that's a really violent problem, right? Whereas now, when we see these problems, we start talking, police chiefs start saying, something's changed. I don't know what it is, but we have to see that these are people, right? And so we're starting to intervene in a much earlier stage, not to allow it to metastasize in our cities to become another violent wave of epidemics. And that's entirely about the way in which we view the humanity, whether or not we think these people are returning, right? So I'll just wrap it by saying, you know, you started by this, there's also lots to be said about prosecutors' decisions and charging. And with all due respect, I mean, Mark, your work is incredible. But I think there is a problem with people like us in that we go to law schools and then we focus on what fancy lawyers focus on, which is the federal levels, right? But the action is in the states, right? I mean, the federal prisoners only represent quite a minor number, and federal drug prisoners even a smaller number. The question is, what are police chiefs and DAs doing? And they get to make charging decisions about whether or not this counts as a violent crime, whether the fight with your brother over drug money is a violent crime or a social problem. And I think a lot depends on whether or not they think this is somebody worth rescuing, right? Whether or not this is somebody who we want back in our community, right? And I'll just wrap up by just pointing out the obvious connection to white-collar crime. Look, there's no question that somebody who commits a robbery destabilizes and terrifies people. We shouldn't be shy about that. But Robert Milliken robbed millions of people of their life savings. And he now goes to very fancy events in impeccably tailored tuxedos. I assure you, I've seen him, right? The difference is, no matter how awful what he did was, and it was, the view was always that he was going to be a citizen that returned to us. And so there's a whole structure about how to punish him and then get him to come back, right? If the view of somebody who's addicted to heroin is, how do we bring this person back to us? You'll have a very different social, institutional, and criminal law response than a view of, it's those people.
Mark, your name was invoked?
Yeah, I have to say one thing that I come at this with, and I won't speak for Jeremy, but I expect he does as well, and that is from a position of faith. That one of the things that I'm deeply convicted by is the fact that the light of God is equal within everyone. And that's something that has not been recognized by the system. When in your introduction of me, I talked about principles rooted in human dignity. Now, that's not necessarily a religious concept. It crosses all kinds of boundaries. But it's something that's been strikingly missing from our approach to narcotics, that it is not seen as who those individuals are. 2 weeks ago, I had a remarkable experience, and that is that I started a clemency clinic at my school and have tried to work with a lot of other schools to start clemency clinics there. And 3 of my guys got out on the same day, all doing life terms. And I got to call them and be the one to tell them that they were going to get out and get to go home. Now, all of them had earned it. I didn't get it for them. They earned it because they had perfect prison records, had done remarkable things in prison. It's credit to them, not to me. But still, I got the bonus of calling them and being the one to tell them that they were going to get out. And it was an unforgettable moment to tell someone that. And that shouldn't have to happen. It shouldn't be redemption after someone like Richard Van Winrow has done 28 years for a relatively small deal. And that's the root of the problem. It's a spiritual failing as much as anything else.
I would add, going to Ekow's points, so the racial dynamics of our response to drugs didn't just start in the 80s either. So if you go back in history, we see a racially disparate response. So in the 1930s, marijuana was seen as a drug that was used, again, by African Americans and Latinos and in inner cities. 30 years later came the 1960s, and mostly white middle-class college students began using marijuana in larger numbers. And public views of marijuana changed almost overnight. Marijuana became celebrated in the popular culture. There were calls for decriminalization. Nothing had changed about the drug itself. What had changed was the perception of who was using that drug. Once we had a different perception about who was using it, attitudes changed dramatically. So I think this tells us something about how we make our policy choices. It calls to question what values and perceptions are behind the public policies that are maybe race neutral on the surface. So 20 years ago, the Sentencing Project put out a report that showed that 1 out of 3 young black men was incarcerated in some way. And President Clinton had a good line, and he said that, what would Americans do if a report came out that said that 1 out of every 3 white boys was in prison? And I think it's pretty clear that there would be a pretty vigorous response from Congress and from the country to that. So I think I agree with what Mark and Ekow said, was that we're really not going to make fundamental change in the system until we see the people who are caught up in the system like we would see our own families. Kind of a variation on the golden rule. You know, how would we want our families treated? That's how we need to think about the people who are addicted to drugs, incarcerated for drugs. We probably wouldn't call the police and demand a mandatory prison sentence for our brother or sister, son or daughter. So why would we do that for our fellow citizens?
Can I just add?
Absolutely.
I just have to, first, I really very much appreciate what both of you said, and I just have to say, look, I mean, we also should be clear that in some sense, a lot of this is not about drugs at all. A lot of this is about using policing to control certain communities, right? I mean, Jeremy put it exactly right. So marijuana at first was seen as sort of, in some ways, innocent, and then it became seen as the drug of black and actually Latino migrant workers actually were seen as using lots of marijuana. So this was a way of controlling them. I always say, look, let's be honest. If what we really cared about was marijuana itself, we would send Trump's deportation teams to invade, we would sweep Madison, Wisconsin, right? UCLA's campus would be a police state. My beloved Michigan, and it is beloved to me, Ann Arbor throws a hash bash every year, right? And I'm not, believe me, I'm a boring, very conservative person in lots of ways. I'm not pro-drugs, right? I'm just anti-insanity, right? So look, if we really cared about marijuana, it would be very obvious the kinds of things we would do to try to root it out. Now, I suspect we should listen to Mark's wise words. It's very clear that there'd be very little we could do to root it out, but we know how we would go about attacking it. What we care about is policing communities where some people are dealing marijuana, because wealthy New Yorkers who want marijuana get their drug dealers to come to their apartment and drop it off. And nobody's interested in prosecuting those people, right? And if you tried, or frankly, if you prosecuted their children, the kids of Michigan, Wisconsin, Texas, right? Austin, my goodness, Austin would be a police state. Right? They would call up their senators and it would end instantly. There's just no question that, as Mark said, our inability to see the common humanity and equal value of these young people is what's driving our policy.
So let's say we got to that point as a society. Would there still be a role for punishment in our response to drug use, drug abuse?
You mean just pure retributive? I would hope not.
Or is the model itself fundamentally flawed?
In a society that is so imbued with racism, to have punishment be a function of government is going to reflect that racism. And so I don't think that that's the problem with having retributivism in its pure form be the motivating factor.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's legitimate for a government to regulate drugs, but the problem is how we take different approaches based on who you are and where you come from. I'm not sure that I agree that the society is imbued with racism, and I'm not sure that we can do that effectively.
Yeah, so, and now I'm going to say very simple, unfortunately flattening things, but unfortunately probably true things. So I actually don't know how I would answer a drug problem as such. I don't know what we should do about especially the most destructive, addictive of drugs. I also think there's a big difference in where you are. I think there's a rightful difference in societies that are facing the introduction of drugs, who have a real shot at keeping it out. I mean, it's not surprising that if you travel internationally and have these discussions, some countries actually are much earlier and thus take much more draconian measures to stop drugs from coming into their society. And while I find those measures stunning, I don't find their position insane because they don't want to be America, right? But I think once you're America, I mean, this is just a simple way of saying there's a difference when you have the first instance of a transmutable disease than when it's a widespread problem. And I think, but my simple answer is if we want to know how we would treat things, if we cared about the people they affected, we should look at what we do when it affects white people, right? Which is a simplistic and stupid way of saying it, except it's true. So if you ask me what would we do, I'd say, well, let's look at what's happened when, for example, the opiate crisis has hit white and rural America. And it turns out we've marshaled huge amounts of resources to start thinking about it as a public health problem. I don't even know if that's the right thing to do, but I suspect it gives us a real world test of what we would do if we cared about the persons affected. I don't think we have to imagine it any longer.
So let me pick up on that. Mark, you are in charge of the universe, or at least a place, and you get to design from scratch, free of the baggage that the three of you have discussed, drug policy for this country or for a place. How does it look differently than our current approach?
Yeah, well, I mean, assuming that place I get to be in charge of looks like America, and we do have that demand for narcotics. One thing is that narcotics are properly regulated. I mean, that you have some things that you have a prescription for. If you don't have a prescription, you're not allowed to buy it, and it's illegal for you to have it. That makes sense to me, that there should be some drugs that are regulated that way, and I don't think we should just throw open the doors of the pharmacies and let you go in and buy whatever you want, or on the street for that matter. But in terms of how to do the one thing we can do through interdiction, which is raise the price somewhat, first of all, I think that's worthwhile. I mean, I know it sounds diminutive that all we can do is raise the price a little temporarily, but we do know that raising the price does reduce use of even very addictive substances. We know that from our experience with cigarettes. Once we raised the taxes on it, smoking rates went down. So it is worthwhile to try, not with the resources we put into it, the way we've been doing it. What I would do is based on experience I had in Texas. So I'm teaching at Baylor, and the Republican Club of Dallas invited me to come up and speak to them. It's right after Spears came up about narcotics policy. And, it's pretty much what you'd expect of a Republican club in Dallas. And I was going along and kind of explaining what I did as a prosecutor, and this guy stands up, and this is not, the Q&A. This is in the middle of my talk. And he says, son, And I'm not going to do the whole accent, but Jeremy probably could. But he said, you know, you're never going to shut down a business by, you know, arresting the greeter at Walmart. And, you know, what I'm saying, a lot of it comes from that one comment from that guy. And so I figured this is a great opportunity. I mean, they're Republicans, they're in Dallas, they're business people for the most part. And so I asked them, okay, how do you shut down a business? And they all said the same thing, and every business audience I've talked to since then says the same thing: cash flow and credit. And so if we want to raise the price by disrupting the businesses, we don't arrest the people. And we don't do these piddling little forfeitures where you take someone's car. You identify the cash flow going back to the source, because they don't have access to traditional credit, and you grab the money. If it's bulk cash going back to Mexico, you use the incredible surveillance abilities we have, and you find it, and you take it, and you keep it. I mean, you're not arresting the guy back in Minneapolis selling cocaine. He just doesn't have a job anymore, at least for a little while. And we have that ability. And one thing that has enhanced it is the FBI has gotten very good at seizing and identifying and seizing material support of terrorism, which often has very complicated routes back. But we know how to get it. So we have that ability. That's what I would do to try to disrupt drug markets where we could.
Jeremy, you're in charge. Fix it.
So going back to a sort of sweeping statement I said earlier about basically the country being racist, I just wanted to give a little bit of factual support for that. So in the criminal justice system, people of color, African Americans in particular, are much more likely to be arrested than whites for the same offenses. When they are prosecuted in federal courts, they're more likely to be charged with penalties that carry mandatory sentencing. Even when they've committed the same offense, African Americans are more likely to get longer sentences than whites. And so really you see throughout the criminal justice system this sort of racial bias. So in that system, in the federal system, and I agree with Ekow that a lot of the action, most of the action is at the state level, but we need to eliminate or at least reduce these mandatory penalties that take discretion away from judges. I don't think it's going to solve all the racial disparities, but allowing judges a safety valve, more flexibility in sentencing, I think is one way to ensure that we don't see some of the harshest outcomes with long prison sentences for drugs.
So, look, I mean, I think one of the things about studying law is you start to realize how subtle many things are, right? So when things are reported in the media, you hear, well, this person is charged with a violent crime, this person was not, that's part of it. Once you actually get in the guts of it, you realize it's not clearly that simple, right? So, look, let's take an ordinary case, a purse snatch, right? So if I steal Professor Sand's wallet, it can be charged as a larceny, petty theft. That's quite, it's going to be handled in a minor way. It's not trivial, and I'll get some punishments and maybe some interdictions, but there you have it. If, however, he reports that I used force, then it'll be a robbery, and that's a very different deal. That's a felony. And that might just turn on whether or not the prosecutor decides that I tugged. I mean, really, it's that, you know. So, and the prosecutor will keep asking him, well, did he tug at your wallet? And, you know, if the prosecutor wants, eventually, Professor Sand will say, yeah, I guess there was a tug there, right? So there are all these subtle ways in which a system that's driven by prosecutors who are happy to keep locking people up as a way to become the next, as a way to become a supervising prosecutor, as a way to then become the DA and then run for governor, right? There's an old joke that people think the problem with every DA is that they want to be governor. It's not true. The problem with every DA is that they want to be president. So, you know, a lot of it is about how we make every little decision and how we decide just on the whole to tackle the problem. I just want to disagree with Mark in one way. It's not actually a disagreement. I think what he said is largely right, but only as these things are, never completely right. So the thing is, there's actually been very interesting controversy about cigarettes and price raises, as you well know. And it turns out that when you have a big jump in cigarette prices, you get depressed use, but only for a short time. And then it goes, you know, people say, I'm not paying an extra $1. And then a week later they go, oh, I'm paying an extra $1, right? So it turns out that the drop of cigarette use is a deeply complicated story, in particular about an entire country that dedicated itself for a generation to tell people not to smoke cigarettes, right? In millions of different ways, as everybody here knows, in a deep concerted social effort, the same as our reduction in drunk driving, right? These are deep commitments that an entire society has to make. My only point is, look, if we're gonna fix this problem, we have to do the same thing, right? You have to dedicate yourself as a society in a 360 way to solving the problem. The problem is when these problems affect communities we don't care enough about, we say, that's too hard, right? But when it's cigarette smoking, we say, we have to do this, right? When it's drunk driving, we said, we can't lose another child, right? So a lot of it depends on not just our elected officials, but how much we're all willing to give, how much we, Mark, you said it in religious terms, which I share, but one need not share them. How much we're gonna see these people as one of us, how much we're gonna care as a society.
Shall we be brave and take some questions from the audience? I think there's some handheld microphones, so if you would wait until microphone is present.
Thanks for the discussion so far. My name is Elijah Hawks. I'm co-principal at Randolph Union and a co-teacher of a class. We've got our class here today. It's a high school just up the road. I'm wondering if you could talk, we've heard a bit about supply and demand in the market for drugs. I'm wondering if you could talk about supply and demand in the market for inmates and the privatization of prisons and how that connects to the conversation so far.
Great question.
So the Sentencing Project has done some work on privatization of prisons. So it's often the first question that we get in forums like this. I think that it's a stain on our democracy, the fact that we have private prisons, that we incarcerate for profit. I think it would be a mistake to focus too much on it, because I don't think that private prisons are the reasons why we have why lawmakers took a tough on crime approach throughout the 80s and 90s. I think it had much more to do with race and political gain. But I think that there's certainly evidence that there are abuses in private prisons. There's a lack of oversight. There's not the services that we expect people to get when they're incarcerated. So it's a reason for concern, but we think shouldn't be the focus of criminal justice reform.
Can I just add that I also think it's a slight mistake to focus on private in the prisons, right? Because one of the things that's happened as we've developed our prison system is that we ship prisoners very far away, disconnected from their homes, disconnected from their families, to small towns where the prison, whether it's private or public, is the economic resource. And so you have the same economic dynamics of a prison town that needs the prison to stay full, regardless of whether it's private or public.
I was wondering what you thought the prospects were for federal legislation that would address some of these problems, and which problems you thought were the most important for federal legislation to address.
So the good news, there's been a lot of pessimism, but the good news is that policymakers, at least in Washington and in a number of states, have begun to recognize some of these problems. In criminal justice reform now is one of the few issues where there seems to be common ground for the parties to work together. In fact, in Washington now, groups like the ACLU, the Sentencing Project, civil rights groups are working with the Koch brothers, the Heritage Foundation, other conservative organizations to try to advance criminal justice reform. Of course, the devil is in the details, but I think that the most important thing at the federal level is to really change these mandatory sentencing laws, particularly for drug offenses. And that's where the legislation has been focused. On the back end, allowing shorter sentences for people who participate in federal prisons and rehabilitative programming, and such as job training, drug treatment, things like that. The question, I think, is whether this sort of bipartisan momentum can be sustained. So we've been in a period of historic lows in crime rates, and we're seeing an uptick in homicide in some major cities. A group of mostly white Southern senators is circulating a Willie Horton style ad. I guess you all know who Willie Horton was, but it was a famous ad in the campaign in the George Bush and Dukakis campaign, featuring an African-American man who became sort of the face of soft on crime. And that's sort of happening again, and the purpose is to kill the sort of sentencing reform bill. And even though the response to heroin has largely been a public health focus, there have been some efforts here and there to sort of get tough on heroin, offer mandatory minimum amendments to increase prison terms for that. And I think there's always a danger of the sort of bad old days of tough on crime coming back. So for those reasons, I think it's important. Some activists say, the bills don't go far enough. We need to hold out for more reform. I think we need to sort of seize this opportunity, make some progress where we can. I think then we can consolidate those gains and move on to the next fight from a stronger position. Whether or not the bill can pass this year, it's looking sort of unlikely. We're 2 months before a presidential election. I know, Secretary Clinton has promised to make this a priority in her administration. Her opponent, not so much. So I think that remains to be seen.
Hi, thanks for coming today. It's been very interesting so far. Seems like some of the conversation has been about moving away from punishment, and I'm wondering if you guys have opinions about sort of flipping this dialogue and instead of criminalizing, decriminalizing, and legalizing certain drugs and regulating, talk about it's a public health crisis. There have been certain states, obviously, that have taken this approach with marijuana, and I'm wondering if on a broad general level, you guys have opinions about legalizing and regulating drugs. Thanks.
Well, I'll go first because my answer is short. That in terms of full legalization, I'm in favor of that for marijuana. I think the social costs are relatively low, but not for other drugs. I do think that legalizing marijuana will go a little bit towards solving some of these other problems as well. For example, when legal marijuana is available, we see lower rates of opioid addiction.
We don't take a position on legalization, so I would defer to Mark and Ekow on that.
I think these are just incredibly difficult questions, and if I had an answer, I wouldn't have kept it this long, really. Look, I will say, from a personal point of view, so I've written philosophical pieces on this, and my rough answer is something like, I do think it's not surprising that philosophical theories converge around prohibiting addictive drugs, because there is something I think that we all see in the way human agency is destroyed when something is addictive. Really hard, heroin strikes me as destructive. Notice, though, that doesn't tell me that the answer to how to deal with heroin is criminalization, right? And so I have the odd position of being quite conservative, as I've said in many of my personal decisions, right? But I've also lived, for example, in Amsterdam for stretches of my life. And it's not as though I rush to recommend the Dutch model at all, but it's obvious to me that a society has to grapple in much more thoughtful ways than our knee-jerk reaction that criminalization is the answer to this kind of thing. Mark did us a favor by reminding us that the big problem here is that we are the wealthiest country in the world and we want to buy this stuff.
One more question, then I think we'll have to wrap it up. Okay.
Hi, I was wondering, recently Sandra Bland's mother received a settlement that included more oversight within the prison, and I've been reading a lot about prisons that lack temperature control, for example, where prisons are extremely hot or freezing cold, and it amounts to some type of cruel and unusual punishment. And I was wondering if you could talk about, it might amount to that. I was wondering if you could talk about just generally how terrible prisons are and whether people are aware of this, and how, practically speaking, we're not going to get away from putting people in prison, I don't think, anytime soon. So what can we do to put in practical oversights to prevent terrible things from continuing to happen?
Briefly, gentlemen. Yeah, I mean, there's some jurisdictions are much better than others. I've visited a lot of prisons. Jeremy's probably visited more, and they vary so much. I mean, in Minnesota, we have some actually very well-run prisons where there is rehabilitation that actually occurs. I was recently at the federal prison in Vermont. It's a terrible prison. And you know, talking to the people there, you can see the destructive force it is in their lives. So we have to take the best practices from the best ones, have the other jurisdictions be willing to spend the money and improve them.
Yeah, I think it's a question of political will and funding. Everyone agrees that if people are going to be incarcerated and they're getting out one day, we should make sure that they can be productive citizens when they get out. But what does that mean? That means getting them an education. It means training them to do a job while they're incarcerated, making sure that they get drug treatment. And we don't even provide those services for people outside of prisons. So it's going to take a larger commitment politically and from all of us as well.
I mean, what is true is that the worst of our prisons are really horrific places. I mean, so there are things. Our jurisprudence has developed to say something roughly along the lines of, if the prison warden didn't order it, it doesn't count as punishment. So we sentence people to be raped. We shouldn't mince words about it. We sentence people to things that would be a violation of the Eighth Amendment, because we know with certainty that this will happen to them when they're there. And I know we keep repeating the same thing, but it really is a case of, if we saw these as people coming back to us, it would be unimaginable that the worst of our prisons look. I'll finish this by saying, it is a stunning feature that the largest state in our union has declared their prison conditions unconstitutional. Right? California declared their prison conditions unconstitutional because they're so overcrowded, so horrific, such lack of services, and such endemic violence.
Final question, comment?
Thank you all for sharing a bit about your personal stories, graduating from law school and then moving into the real world afterwards. One thing that you have a bunch of potential future criminal attorneys here, whether that's defense or deputy prosecutors. On an individual level, folks starting out at the beginning of their careers, what would you recommend them to do to start tackling some of the pieces of the problem you've highlighted today? And thank you.
Well, the most important thing is to work at retail. And I mean, we do wholesale work, policy work, but the retail side of going into a prison, of meeting someone. And the other thing is this: I know this is a school that's full of advocates, and I want to say something about that. You know, one thing I didn't explain was how I went from being that prosecutor to being the person that pursued the other side. And here's what happened. I went into those sentencings, and there was often federal defenders on the other side. And in Detroit, particularly, there were two, Richard Helfrich and Andrew D'Ensimo. And I would, you know, it was a mandatory case. I didn't even bring the file over. And I remember once the judge saying to D'Ensimo, "Are you going to make your usual futile speech?" And he went on for 20 or 25 minutes about what this was going to do to that young man, what it was doing to his community, the African-American community in the city. You know, how this wasn't solving a problem. And eventually, it worked on me. None of those people got a lesser sentence. They were mandatory. So anyways, after Spears came down, I got calls from a bunch of judges because it gave judges more discretion. They were very happy about this. And one was from a judge named Art Tarnow in Detroit. And he said, "What happened to you? You were a hard ass." And I told him the story I just told you about the futile speeches. And he said, "Did you ever tell Andrew that?" And I never had. You know, and so I called him up. But here's the thing, is that if you're an advocate, whether it's for this, the environment, whatever, It may feel like you're making futile speeches, but you don't know who's listening or how it's going to impact them. Don't go home thinking no one heard you. Andrew D'Ensimo didn't go home thinking, well, I changed the prosecutor's mind, but he did. They won't tell you, and you won't see the effects that you have, the lives or the rivers, I mean, whatever it is you're out to save. But give those futile speeches, and might as well start now.
I can't improve on that, but I'll just mention the example of my boss, Mark Maurer, who's been working on these issues for almost 40 years. And if you look at we have this graph on our website that shows that during his time there, the incarceration has just skyrocketed the entire time. But I think finally in recent years, there's starting to be a change in attitudes about these issues. So just to Mark's point, you know, keep the faith, and you know, don't lose heart as you see failure, because you have to have faith that your work will, that the seeds you sow will pay off in the end. So.
Final words.
Well, now I'm 2 strikes down.
It's tough.
This is tough. It is hard for me to improve on that. Look, I do try to tell my students that we have a role to play, and it's actually a couple people have said, I will be paying my student loans presumably, and just before I die. But if I had it to do over again, I'd go to law school 5 times again. I wake up every day thinking I'm blessed to have this kind of role. One of the cases my law firm represented was Bush v. Gore, most famously represented Al Gore in front of the Supreme Court. And I always take such great heart in that in America, when the president is up, the presidency is up to controversy, we don't call the army, we call lawyers. That's a noble thing. And I know our election has been going on for 1,000 years, but we should remember, you know, Franklin said it's a republic if you can keep it. We have a really wonderful job to do in that. I'll just end by saying, look, I tell my students, you can do more good as a great prosecutor in 1 day than you can as a zealous defender in a month. That's not always true, though, because part of it is, and so here I'll part a little bit from Mark, part of it's fighting both retail and upstream, because I have lots of students who go into prosecution and then leave quickly. They're exhausted being the only person in the office. So it means a DA who's going to change the culture of their office. And lastly, it means for us, we have to take our case to the people. I think sometimes we lose heart in that. It's very easy to play old politics. I locked up a bunch of people, the crime rates fell. And it's not till some lawyer stands up and says, the crime rates were the exact same 2 years ago. You locked up a bunch of people because it's an election year. This is nonsense. And take heart that if you make that message elegantly, you can be elected DA, not just do the same boring thing that you know deeply was unjust. Mark looked and said, this isn't right, and he changed it. We are citizens, and we can take our message to our fellow citizens and have faith that there really are better angels in us.
So much more to talk about, and yet somehow I feel like our work is done. So let's thank our 3 panelists for their great work.